Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Now, I know I just did a Necron video, and I usually try to change things up a little bit more, but I did reference the Destroyers quite a bit in the video of the Flayed Ones. So I figured I might as well elaborate a bit on these cruel, maniacal machines as well. And from a certain point of view, the Destroyers are even more evil than the Flayed Ones. At least the flesh-draped machine monsters have an excuse for their irrational behavior. They are infected by a magical space virus created by a star-devouring vampire god. That is valid excuse for anyone to go a little bit nutty. But the Destroyers, they chose this. They elected to become the very antithesis of life, and to begin their great and holy quest to eradicate anything and everything that breathes, eats, or shits in the entire galaxy. Now, you might consider this to be a somewhat extreme opinion, and I would be inclined to agree. So how exactly did they arrive at this rationale then? Well, as mentioned in the Flayed Ones video, the soulless machines that plague the galaxy today was once a race of flesh and blood like us, the Necron tier, and they were transformed into their chrome dome forms by the C'tans' science/magic. But again, what the C'tans failed to inform the Necron tier of was that they would lose pretty much all emotions and personality, and be reduced to little more than tin soldiers at the commands of the C'tans. Unfortunately for the star-devouring vampires, they underestimated the willpower of at least some of the higher classes of Necrons, who managed to resist the spells being placed upon their metallic bodies, and they led an uprising against the C'tans, overthrowing, shattering, and enslaving them in turn. But this came far too late to salvage the war in the heavens that the Necron tier and the C'tans had been waging as allies against the Old Ones and their own creations, such as the Orcs and the Eldar. And so the Necrons went undercover. They buried themselves on tomb worlds and sent all of their loyal machine puppets into a dormancy cycle set to last millions of years. And only recently have they begun to awaken yet again. But for some of the Necrons, their dormancy cycles did not go quite to plan, and when they woke up, their software and hardware had taken a dent or two. Now, I have had some harsh mornings in my life as well, when I have considered a violent action or two against a mirror or a particularly infuriating piece of toilet paper. You know, the mornings where you stub your toe, you put your socks on the wrong feet and stumble when you try to put on your pants. But I have never woken up quite so grumpy as to consider the annihilation of all life. But then again, I've never been asleep for 65 million years either, so perhaps I lack, perspective. Or perhaps it is because there is an even better explanation for the Destroyer's catastrophically cantankerous mood. There is, again, some suspicions that maybe the stasis field technology was not quite up to the task of keeping all of the Necrons entirely dormant for 65 million years. And so a bevy of little bugs have snuck into the Necrons' programming. And I'm sure this is certainly part of the problem, but I think there is a deeper psychological reason for why the Destroyers get so very, very testy. The first point that needs to be made is that all Destroyers hail from the upper echelons of Necron society. Now, by and large, you could pretty much slice the entirety of modern-day Necron society into two categories: those who rule and those who serve. But there are, as always, a couple more nuances once you look deeper. The reason why the rulers rule, you see, is because they are the strong-willed individuals who manage to resist the transformation into soulless undead machine skeletons, at least partially. Most of their emotions are long gone, with a handful of exceptions here and there, and, well, even the most well-preserved of the Necron overlords is quite severely lacking in empathy. But even these soulless husks of what was once living, breathing creatures are downright humane compared to the vast majority of the Necrons. The warriors, for example, are little more than mindless automatons. They still do possess a spark of individuality, just about enough for them to act relatively intelligently whilst on the battlefield, seeking cover, firing against the most threatening target, so on, so on. Beyond this, very little, if indeed anything, in the way of true personality or emotions remain. Except for one overriding, near universal racial desire for all Necrons, namely the need to return to the Necron tier existence, their age of flesh. They all perceive what the C'tans did to them as a hideous betrayal of the most vile kind, and they would do anything to return to the days of the living. But this is, of course, an impossibility. Oh, well, never say never, I suppose. I mean, after all, there is magic to turn living beings into mechanical undead skeletons, so why shouldn't there be magic to turn them back again? But as far as the Necrons are aware, and the C'tans for that matter, since the Necrons have de facto enslaved the poor bastards, there is no way to undo what the C'tans did to the Necron race. And so, those Necrons intelligent enough to understand the problem will have to deal with the fact that they have an unbreakable desire to return to the days of living, whilst also understanding that it is not something that can happen, that it is a literal impossibility, that it is a desire that will never ever be fulfilled, no matter how many millions of years they may exist. Of course, the Necron warriors don't have this problem. They do not really have the cognitive functions to be able to analyze this. All they have is a deep-seated desire to return to their previous forms, without the intellect to analyze this feeling or build upon it. However, those of the higher ranks of Necrons, the Lich Guards, the Deathmarks, and the Immortals, all possessed of considerably greater cognitive functions, are not only cursed with the urge to return, but they are also intelligent enough to understand that they cannot, and that they never will be able to do so. Now that can drive someone insane. An overwhelming urge to do something, a raison d'etre, something you cannot deny, something inherent within your very being that you also intellectually understand can never happen. Oh yeah. Oh yes. That is some delicious mind horror in and of itself. And so it is only natural that some of these creations, again capable of considerably more complex thought patterns than the warriors, would eventually reach the self-preserving conclusion that all life must be eradicated. Just think about it. You want this thing so bad, but you can never have it. And yet, there are reminders of this thing you cannot have all around you. Life flourishes throughout the galaxy in a billion trillion different forms. Everywhere you look is the thing you want to be but can never be. A reminder in every glance, a reminder around every corner, on every planet, in every battle encounter, in every scrap of data you process. all the way up until the point where eventually the mind laboring under an unceasing, unbearable strain simply just snaps and decides to begin removing all of the reminders. If I cannot live, neither shall anything else. You can hear the grin on my face. I do love the Necrons' backstory. I hate them on the tabletop. I genuinely do. I am still scarred from picking up the very first Necron Codex, reading it, and thinking to myself, is this fucking it? Before handing it back in and picking up some Eldar instead. The little knife ears may be abhorrent creatures, but I was having a bit of a high elf phase at the time, and frankly, their codex was still a hell of a lot more interesting than the first Necron one. An example of a retcon that was actually good. Rare though those may be, the Necrons are certainly a wonderful example. Now let's talk a little bit more about the specific role that the Necron destroyers fulfill on the battlefield, and firstly, within Necron undead society. Because whilst the Flayed Ones are of course shunned because they are literally contagious, and exist within their own pocket dimension or on very unique tomb worlds ruled over by peculiar individuals, the destroyers are not quite so ostracized, because their particular mental affliction is not, as far as anyone is aware yet at the very least, contagious. But they are still kept at the very fringes of the tomb worlds, a good distance away from any of the regular warrior classes, just in case the Necron destroyers' programming errors start spreading throughout the ranks. And they are of course segregated with extreme prejudice from those types of Necrons that they originally hailed, the Immortals, the Deathmarks, and the Lich Guards. Since in that case, it is not a virus, it is not a programming error, it is de facto a philosophical worldview that led to their de-evolution, most Necron overlords would probably say, into a destroyer. And it is also important to point out here that whilst the Flayed Ones are not allowed into any of the regular tomb worlds, Necron destroyers are. They are still kept around as a shunned but still regular part of a tomb world's military forces, though they are treated with considerable contempt is probably the correct word by most rulers of tomb worlds, because they cannot be relied upon. A Necron warrior will do whatever his overlord demands, as will an Immortal or a Deathmark or a Lich Guard or any other Necron warrior. They can be relied upon to carry out the plans of their master without fail. Whereas the Destroyers, well, they are far too individualistic, too much initiative in their ranks. If they see an opportunity to inflict more death and destruction, they will take it regardless of their master's plans, and they will not honor any treaties, any boundaries, or any rulings put in place by their masters. For example, many a Necron overlord would prefer to remain hidden for periods of time whilst massing their strength, bringing their warriors out of stasis and preparing their war machine. If he was to awaken a group of Immortals who then decide, you know what, no, we're just going to eradicate everything and turn into destroyers, they are not simply just going to obediently hide. Instead, they will wander forth from the tomb worlds to annihilate any and all life within range of their Gorse weaponry, regardless of any instructions to do otherwise from their overlords. In the best case scenario, this could be a minor inconvenience, If they merely destroy the life on some backwater planet, well, not that big of a problem. The Necron Overlord is not going to be overly inconvenienced by that. But if, say, this particular tomb world was a part of a much larger, more heavily populated planet of, say, for example, strategic importance to the Imperium, then a bunch of Necron destroyers running amok in the streets will undoubtedly draw the attention of a great deal of enemies. And if they arrive before the Overlord has fully mobilized his armies, then his newly risen reign could be an awfully short one indeed. And even in less extreme circumstances than this, well, there is certainly a great deal of truth in the old saying that it is better to have no allies than those who you cannot trust. Even if the existence of the dynasty and the tomb world are not at risk, fighting alongside warriors who, at any given time, might simply choose to ignore their commander's orders, that is a pretty severe liability. One which, if left unchecked, could easily turn victory into defeat. You may even now be wondering why the destroyers are even allowed to exist in the first place. Why are they not treated exactly the same as the flayed ones? If they pose such a threat both potentially to a tomb world and to a Necron Overlord strategic and tactical planning, why are they not hounded and destroyed on sight? Granted, again, they may not be contagious, but they surely pose a considerable threat to an Overlord's plans and his overall goals. And yes, this is absolutely true, but for all their faults, the Destroyers are very, very good at what they do. And the potential danger they pose to an Overlord's battle plans, and even potentially his overall strategic position, is mostly overshadowed by their sheer destructive power on the battlefield. Because there is simply nothing a destroyer will not do to enhance his ability to murderize absolutely everything. Whilst almost all other Necrons prefer to maintain their base form, a vaguely humanoid shape as a reminder of what they once were, the Necron destroyers are a big deviation from this. Their torsos grow larger so as to better support a heavier targeting system, and instead of carrying a weapon, it is implanted directly within their arms. Their weapons become a literal part of their being. And what a weapon it is as well. The regular destroyer carries the Gauze Cannon, essentially a Gatling gun version of the regular Necron Gauze Flayer. This weapon is far heavier and far more energy intensive than the regular version, and so the Necron destroyer's spine is strengthened, allowing it to pass even more power to the weapon, and its shoulders are yet further broadened to allow it to carry the weight. But the most immediately visually apparent difference between a destroyer and any other Necron is, of course, that they do not possess legs. Instead, they maneuver across the battlefield with surprising speed for something so massive, so bulky, and heavily armed and armored by utilizing huge anti-gravity propulsion units that have grown from their waists. Such is the speed, power, and maneuverability of these platforms that in earlier editions, Necron destroyers were essentially considered jet bikes. And they are swift indeed, allowing for the destroyer to reposition itself and unleash devastating firepower upon the enemy in the blink of an eye. And what firepower it is as well. As mentioned, the Gauss cannon is a quad-barreled version of the regular Necron Gauss weaponry. The warriors carry a single-barreled version. The Immortals, the heavy infantry, carry Gauss blasters, a double-barreled version, and this is 4 barrels. And as we all know, 4 gun barrels is always better than 1, and even better than 2. Capable of engulfing entire infantry squads in rivulets of flaying and flensing fire, the Gauss cannon can literally strip the flesh from enemies. Even the regular Necron weapon, the Gauss Flayer, more than deserves its name, and the cannon is an even bigger, more horrifying version. If a human is hit by such a weapon, he will literally be flayed and disintegrated molecule by molecule, layer of flesh by layer of flesh, until literally nothing remains. Even just being wounded by this weapon will inevitably lead to death. Unless you possess the requisite plot armor, of course. And it better be plot armor specifically, because measly regular armor will provide very little, if any, protection against such a weapon. And even then, it's not even the heaviest armament that a destroyer can carry. Some of the more fanatical members of the destroyer cult has evolved to carry the heavy Gauss cannon. As the name quite blatantly suggests, this is the same as the Gauss cannon, but instead of spreading the energies across 4 barrels, allowing for a monstrous rate of fire, all of the flaying energies of the weapon is focused in one single weapon's discharge. The tremendous amounts of energies required means that the weapon has a much slower rate of fire, but it also makes the weapon a vehicle killer extraordinaire. The crew of any armored vehicle targeted by a heavy Gauss cannon may as well wrap themselves in a protective shielding of hopes and dreams, because that will do them just as much good as any vehicle armor against a heavy Gauss cannon. And to present an even more lethal threat to the enemy, destroyers occasionally operate in mixed formation, with regular destroyers armed with Gauss cannons flying alongside a single heavy destroyer with its vehicle-slaying weapon, allowing them to deal equally well with both infantry and armor. When combined with their extraordinary speed, that is a truly terrifying proposition. And with the relatively recent addition of the Locust Heavy Destroyer, an even fatter, more horrible version of the Heavy, and the Skorpek destroyers, a melee version of these long-range masters of murder, I am sure the destroyers will live up to their name for a long time yet. And let us then wrap it up with a mention of the Necron Destroyer Lord as well. Because, as mentioned, unlike the Curse of the Flayed Ones, the destroyers choose their path. They are driven, de facto, insane, but it is nevertheless an affliction of the mind, a world view, an ideology, you might even say. And therefore, even the highest members of Necron society, the lords and overlords, are vulnerable to it. And when one of these higher masters decide to join the destroyer cult, oh, that is when something truly frightening is born. For whilst the destroyers are driven simply by their immediate urges to kill and destroy anything and everything within their grasp, they are naturally limited by that very thing. Their range, their grasp, their ability to extend their influence. No matter how violent or bloodthirsty a destroyer is, he will at best only be able to destroy everything on the planet that he is currently on, whilst the Destroyer Lord can marshal all of the resources of entire tomb worlds. He can command fleets and enter the Dolomon Gates. He pairs the unending drive for destruction with the cold, cynical, strategic, and tactical mind of someone born to rule. If a Destroyer is a threat to a planet, a Destroyer Lord is a threat to a galaxy. And, lest we forget, the higher-ranking Necrons were granted even more powerful, even more versatile machine bodies than any of their underlings. For all the prowess of a regular Destroyer, it absolutely pales in comparison to that of a Lord. Possessing even more destructive weaponry, an even tougher frame, and even more advanced self-repair systems, he is virtually indestructible. And even if one could reduce him to nothing more than a broken, scattered husk of shattered metal and twisted parts, a state from which any other Destroyer could never recover, for the Lord it is merely a question of time until he can resume his annihilating ways. And whilst I must myself too admit that the Destroyers don't have quite the creepy factor of the flayed ones, in all due reality, they are probably a much, much larger threat to the galaxy as a whole. But hey, if your world gets invaded by Destroyers, at least your death will take seconds, rather than the minutes or hours that death at the hands of a flayed one could take. Always look on the bright side, eh? Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. As always, if you liked the video, please do consider sharing it around and liking it, since that is what helps out the YouTube algorithm the most. Have a good day.